The US military is yet to face its greatest adversary, the climate crisis. A new study by the Pentagon claims that climate change is likely to result in increasing conflicts, diseases, blackouts, migrations, famines, as well as endanger fixed military outposts and bases. Without a significant policy shift, the disasters would exceed the White House capacity to cope and might trigger the downfall of the US military. All this could happen over the next 3 decades. I'm your host Shirvan and welcome to Caspian Report. Special thanks to Santa Barbara Chocolate for sponsoring this episode. As a chocolate connoisseur, they bring high-end brands to the online market at wholesale prices. It's easy and affordable. Some of their best sellers include the smooth 100% pure cocoa chocolate with no added sugar, or the cocoa flavanol preserved dark chocolate, and many others. Visit their site and treat yourself. Use the promo code CaspianReport to get 15% off any item in any category. You'll find the links in the description and the comment section. Rising global temperatures, melting sea ice, and more extreme weather patterns are all increasing by the year. But if ecological disaster wasn't enough reason to act on global climate change, there are national security factors to consider. A new report by the Pentagon, commissioned by the Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, the highest ranking and senior-most military officer in the United States Armed Forces, calls on the US military to prepare for several climate-related disasters by mid-century. The main emphasis of the report is that the more time and effort the military has to spend on the effects of climate change, the fewer resources it has to combat other threats. The consequences are already visible. In the wildfires of California in 2019, the Pentagon used C-130 transporters as water bombers. The same happened in Australia, where military planes were deployed to dump quantities of flame retardants on the bushfires. When floods or hurricanes hit Florida and Texas and strong winds came up the East Coast, it damaged bases like Langley. When Hurricane Michael made landfall in the United States in 2018, Tyndall Air Force Base reported that 17 of its F-22 Raptor fighters were damaged and about 11,000 personnel had to be relocated elsewhere. The repair cost racked up a total bill of $4.7 billion. The point is that, unlike politicians, the top brass in the military does not have the luxury to haggle over climate change because the military must deal with the reality on the ground. So while the White House ignores climate change, the Pentagon is planning for it.
When I look at climate change, it's in the category of sources of conflict around the world and things we'd have to respond to. So it can be great devastation requiring humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, which the U.S. military certainly conducts routinely.
At the macro level, the Pentagon study claims that the U.S. military is vulnerable to recurring disasters like flooding and drought. Since nearly all of the most important military bases in the United States are located on either the West Coast or the East Coast, the American military machine is at risk as sea levels rise and flooding becomes more imminent. If sea levels rise moderately, bases along the East and Gulf Coast could see flooding 100 times a year by mid-century. This is problematic because flooding damages roads, buildings, runways, warplanes, ammunition, and even displaces military personnel and their families. According to the Pentagon, at least 128 military bases would be at risk following 90 centimeters in sea level rise, with many bases at risk to submerge in the coming years. As early as 2050, 4 of the 9 coastal mid-Atlantic states would lose about 10% of their land area. By 2070, the number of floods per year would persist daily, making the terrain part of the sea.
And as you know, General Walters and I, we share bases of pretty much waterfront property all over the world. So if the ocean is going to rise, we're going to be impacted everywhere. So it does demand a kind of a comprehensive look at all of our bases.
Now we can't go over each case separately, but here are some few noteworthy bases along the East Coast that are at risk. From north to south there is Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, Coast Guard Station Sandy Hook, US Naval Academy, Washington Navy Yard, Joint Base Anacostia Bolling, Joint Base Langley Eustis, Naval Station Norfolk, Naval Air Station Oceana, Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune, Marine Corps Air Station Beaufort, Marine Corps Recruitment Depot Paris Island, Hunter Army Airfield, Naval Submarine Base Kings Bay, Naval Station Mayport, Naval Air Station Key West, Eglin Air Force Base, and more. The damage to each base varies, but military installations in the mid-Atlantic states, such as New Jersey and Virginia, are at risk of destruction, including Naval Station Norfolk, which is the world's largest naval base and home to the US Fleet Forces Command. Increased flooding will also complicate existing logistics. About 80% of the US agricultural exports and 78% of imports come in through ports. Many of those ports will be subject to flooding, which will eventually delay and disrupt the movement of food supplies, ammunition, military hardware, and even military personnel. America will still be able to get by, but the more time and effort is spent dealing with such logistical issues, the fewer resources the military will have to deal with other threats. And other risks are plenty. The Pentagon report argues that the US national power grid is grossly unprepared for meteorological stress. Most of the power grid infrastructure was not built to withstand alternating conditions, and of particular risk are the electricity generating power plants, electric transmission infrastructure, and distribution system components. New weather patterns, such as increasing rainfall levels or extended periods of heat, could overwhelm the grid. We're already seeing the effects of this. In 2019, utility power firms shut down power to more than 1 million citizens across California to avoid power lines sparking another wildfire during the dry season. Moreover, from the 1950s to the 1980s, the number of significant power outages averaged fewer than 5 per year. In 2007, however, there were 76 significant power outages, and in 2011 there were more than 300. This is a taste of things to come, and it doesn't even factor in threats like cyber attacks by external players. If the power grid were to collapse, the Pentagon notes that America would experience a loss of water and waste distribution systems, heating and electrical lighting systems, a loss of computer and communication systems, including satellite networks, GPS services. It would also result in a loss of public transportation, fuel distribution, and all electrical systems that do not have backup power. It would be the perfect storm. Even nuclear power facilities are not safe. Of the 99 nuclear reactors currently operating in the United States, about 60% are located in major risk areas that will be affected by sea level rise, water shortages, droughts, etc. The Pentagon's dystopian forecast also covers the risk of disease. Average annual temperatures are expected to increase between 1 to 3 Celsius by 2050. As the weather becomes warmer, North America will see the proliferation of mosquitoes, ticks, and fleas. These new conditions will spur diseases which had previously been unheard of in the United States. Malaria, dengue, and Zika will spread beyond the tropical zone and infect more people on the American mainland. Other diseases, such as Lyme disease, that are native to colder climates, will proliferate as warmer winters will ensure that insects and their eggs will not expire because of the cold. Thawing permafrost across many areas of the Arctic will also create abundant habitats of bogs and marshes for disease-carrying insects to live and grow. These diseases will not only affect civilian populations native to these areas, but will also make it harder for the US military to operate in these climates. Essentially, climate change acts as a threat multiplier. It makes unstable situations across the globe even worse. One place that is of urgent concern is Bangladesh, a nation of 161 million people, half of which live at sea level. If half the country is made uninhabitable due to rising sea levels, some 80 million people will be permanently displaced. Most will migrate elsewhere within Bangladesh, but millions will seek shelter abroad. And considering today's xenophobic political environment, the flow of climate refugees will create enduring socio-political instability in South Asia. Now, Bangladesh is only one country. Globally, some 600 million people live at sea level, and all those communities are at risk. In one way or another, the climate-related disputes will drag the United States into the frenzy, which is why the Pentagon study also warns that the US military should prepare for new missions abroad in Syria-style conflicts. Another ignition point the Pentagon considers is water scarcity. While the coastal communities across the globe will face flooding, some interior areas will be hit by drought. The risk is especially pronounced in the Middle East, Southern Africa, China, and the United States. By 2040, global demand for fresh water will exceed availability. Places where population increase is strong and water management is weak will have it especially bad. The decline in water availability will lead to social unrest and possibly trigger new civil conflicts. Syria offers a glimpse into the future. Most will not remember this, but the first anti-government protests in Syria started over water shortage. A 10-year drought forced some rural communities to relocate to the urban centers, but they received no aid from the government. Those affected took to the streets and inadvertently triggered nationwide social unrest, leading to the current war. So climate change escalates existing disputes, and we could see many Syria-like conflicts across the world in the coming decades. The US Department of Defense would be tasked to intervene for humanitarian reasons, but much like in Syria, each case carries a risk to spiral beyond control. Water scarcity will also hurt food supply lines. In countries such as the Philippines, Pakistan, and Nigeria, the typical household spends more than 40% of its earnings on nourishment. In the first half of the 21st century, the world population is predicted to almost double. However, 95% of that growth will take place in developing countries where food insecurity is high. With increasing risks such as extensive heat, cold, soil erosion, increasing pestilence, unpredictable weather conditions, etc., crop yields will fluctuate greatly. Some nations will be on the brink of starvation. As a result of these conditions, food insecurity will no longer be a theory examined by academics, but a tangible fact of life. The slightest disruption in food supplies could trigger social unrest and civil conflict. In Iran, for example, nationwide protests erupted in 2018 after food prices increased. Such scenarios could multiply in the future. Beyond sea level rise, droughts, a fragile power grid, and diseases, the Pentagon also envisions the opening of a new geopolitical front in the Arctic Circle. As the ice melts and new waterways open, shipping could become faster and cheaper. The opening of the Arctic Ocean will also uncover about 1/4 of the world's uncharted hydrocarbon reserves, making fossil fuels more readily available. However, where there is open opportunity, there is also open competition. Territorial claims in the Arctic are not well established and continue to be disputed amongst the Arctic nations. But while in the past, the geography of the Arctic acted as a buffer, by mid-century, it will become a new military front in America's north. The new Arctic Ocean is mission critical to the defense of continental North America. Russia, for instance, already has the world's largest icebreaker fleet and is extending its Arctic reach with more than a dozen new military installations. Currently, the Russians have 16 deep water ports, 13 airfields, 20 air defense sites, and are constructing 10 search and rescue stations. The Kremlin is also developing a new line of stealthy cruise missiles. Dubbed as the KH-101 or KH-102 Raduga, these are low-altitude, radar-evading missiles that can carry conventional or nuclear payloads. Then there are weapons like hypersonic missiles, a field of study where the Russians are ahead of the competition.
It was a time where we, for decades, actually used the sea as a moat and really didn't have to worry from the threats directly coming against the homeland from the sea. That has fundamentally changed, as you were mentioning, relative to the weapons that are being created.
Point in case, Russia's Arctic outposts not only help to secure its interests, but could even be deployed in much of continental North America. It's clear by the Pentagon study that US defense officials anticipate a prolonged role for the US military because in each disaster situation, the US Army would be called to assist. However, the growing number of emergency responses, both domestic and foreign, would exceed the military's capacity, so much so that the US military might not be able to function at all. Man is as much a product of his climate as he is his temperament. Civilizations have risen and fallen because of climate disasters as much as they have risen and fallen because of their response to such trends. With each passing day, the climate crisis is becoming more difficult to deny and even harder to ignore. The irony in the Pentagon study is that the carbon footprint of the US military is greater than many industrialized nations. If the US military were a country, it would rank as the 55th largest CO2 emitter in the world. For most of the 20th century, the United States has acted in a world where it experienced very little environmental repercussions from a changing climate. Now, however, the Department of Defense must scramble to come up with a blueprint to protect its bases, assets, and interests from the effects of climate change it helped to accelerate. I've been your host Shirvan from Caspian Report. Special thanks to Thomas for helping me with this report. Thank you for watching, and Sahol.